The year 41 was a very, very, very challenging year for early Christianity. If you were in the early church, and let's say you had joined, whether you were a friend of Paul's or not at that point, but you were a young Jewish Christian or perhaps a Hellenistic Christian, a Greek-speaking Christian in Jerusalem. When it came to the year 41, you thought that it was going to be the end of the world. Now, I don't know how to say this except to say, when we read early church history, we want to go, oh, look at the early church, and oh, they were a little persecuted by the authorities, and there's this great missionary movement, and Paul's out there in a mission field doing stuff. And what we're not aware of is all the stuff that's going on historically in the background. Now, during the 30s, going into the 40s, into the 50s, and into the 60s, is a growing movement within Judaism that is very, very oriented toward holiness and holiness codes. Holiness codes are codes, like we would call them purity codes. They're kind of do's and don'ts, things you can do and things you can't do. And if you do the don'ts and you don't do the do's, you are a sinner and you will burn. So in this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about 41, some of the historical background prior to that. We're going to talk about the effect it had on Jerusalem Christianity in the Apostle Paul. And we're going to look at some Second Temple Jewish eschatology. I want to try and give you a feel for something here, okay? And don't be surprised. Your mind is going to make a connection. I know it is, and we'll talk about that later. Your mind is going to make a connection, and you're going to realize that what you were sold in the church as the gospel is not the gospel. And it can play with your head a bit if you let it. So, first, in the winter of the year 39 and 40, so remember, the church is 6-7 years old. Paul's been a little Christian for 6 years, and we know for the first 3 of those years he disappeared into Arabia, okay? Then he comes back, and he does a little mission trip, and that includes Thessalonica, and it includes Corinth, okay? He goes to Greece, essentially. He has his little mission there in Achaia and the Corinthian Peninsula. And there is going to be an event where Gaius Caligula makes the decision to have a statue of himself made to be placed in the temple in Jerusalem. Just stop. Think about this for 1 second. We have a backstory here that is going to be very important. And that backstory can be found in the book of Daniel. Now, the book of Daniel is not composed 400 years before Jesus by some guy named Daniel. The book of Daniel is composed during the time of the Maccabean Revolution. And it's during this revolution time that there is a foreign leader, Antiochus Epiphanes. And Antiochus Epiphanes has a very antagonistic relationship with Jews and the Jerusalem temple leadership and the reigning authorities. And so he comes in and he slaughters a pig on the Jerusalem altar. Now, as you know, pig's blood is unclean. That forced the priests to remove those stones. They had to take those altar stones and they had to put them in storage as they put it, until Elijah came to tell us what to do with them, because they were sacred. They'd been used for however long to have the sacrifices, but now they were defiled, so they couldn't be used, but they couldn't be destroyed either. So they got put in a little room there. But into this act of Antiochus Epiphanes to slaughter blood, a pig's blood, on the altar, the Jewish altar, led to the revolt, the Maccabean revolt, that would free Judaism for a season, for about maybe 100 years, from foreign domination, foreign rule. Okay? The Maccabean Revolution starts with zealous, fervent believers who will engage in guerrilla warfare. They'll come out of the foothills of Judea, attack a small Roman group of soldiers, kill them all, and run back into the hills. It's I don't know that it's the first known example of guerrilla warfare, but it's certainly the one that has become the model for modern guerrilla warfare. It's essentially how the Afghanis, the Taliban, and others managed to beat the Soviet Union and the United States in Afghanistan, is this form of guerrilla warfare. Small groups of marauders coming out, creating destruction, and then going back and hiding in their caves. This was the Maccabees. Now, the Maccabees were motivated by a particular figure in the Old Testament, and that figure is in the book of Numbers. And that figure's name is Phinehas. And Phinehas is their example of someone who loves the holy God enough to kill in the name of that holy God and out of zeal for holiness. And in the book of Numbers, the story of Phinehas is recorded, where there is a Midianite woman and an Israelite man, and they decide to go cohabit in the tent. And in comes Phinehas, because this is intermarriage and blah, blah, blah. And he runs his spear through both of them, ending the happy session. And God said in the text, God, and I put God in air quotes, God says, I love this. I was going to put a plague on Israel, but since Phinehas did this, I'm not going to put a plague on Israel. This is great. This is wonderful. I'm going to give this guy an eternal priesthood, not a temporary one, an eternal one. I love Phinehas. This is beautiful. Phinehas is my man. You know, he's kind of like, I don't know, Chuck Norris and Rambo all put together. And, you know, he's just this like superhero figure. Well, he was the inspiration for the Maccabees. And it's at this time, but 160 years before Jesus, 163 is the BCE is the marker, but we don't know when Jesus was quite born. But at any rate, about 160 years before Jesus, and we have these revolutionaries coming out of the hills. Phinehas is in the back of their minds as they're killing in the name of the Lord. That's what they're doing, just killing in the name of the Lord, kind of like Jerry Falwell said, we'll kill them in the name of the Lord, he said. So that's what these folks are doing. Of course, they liberate Israel through this a particular revolution and go on to establish a dynasty, which will create all manner of problems. But that event gets celebrated every year in Judaism, and it's known as Hanukkah. Okay? So the Maccabean revolution is kept alive through Hanukkah, but it's also kept alive if you currently are a Jew in Israel and you are required to participate in the military. One of the things you do that's in the conclusion of your military training is to go up at night up to Masada. And Masada is the little fortress on top of the hillock there near the Dead Sea, where the last of the revolutionaries of the year 70 ended up committing suicide together as a group, Jim Jones style, rather than allow the Romans to conquer them. And again, it's the Phinehas Maccabean tradition that gets relived here. This holy war mentality that gets relived within Judaism. But at the time of 41, by the time we get to 41, we are familiar with the Zealot movement. Now, whether the Zealots are a political party, probably not. Zealots were probably not organized as like the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the Essenes. Zealotry would have permeated all these groups, not the Sadducees. The Sadducees wouldn't be zealots, but certainly the Pharisees could be. There would be zealot Pharisees. There would be zealot Essenes who were priests. So you have this attitude toward holiness that still creates trouble for the authorities. Now, when Gaius Caligula makes the determination to make a statue of himself and put it into Jerusalem, he does this by having the statue carved and created out of quarries there in Syria, which is just 100 miles north or less of Jerusalem. I mean, it's being made right there. And it takes a long time to make a statue like that. And so it's well known that this is being made. It's coming. They're going to put a statue of Caligula into the temple, the Holy of Holies. Oh my God, they're going to put Trump in the White House. I'm kidding. That's a joke. It's meant as a joke. Okay. But you see what I'm saying? This is a big, big deal. And so it's going to naturally really anger those that are particular toward getting angry at things like that. And they will engage in skirmishes with the authorities. And the setup for all this occurs in the year 39. Down in the southern part of Israel is a little town called Jamnia or Yavne. The Jews, after the destruction of the temple, will use Jamnia or Javne to come together. That's where the rabbis, Rabbi Yohan ben Zakkai and others, come to begin to reformulate what it means to be Jewish without a temple. But here, 30 years, 40 years previously, in the year 39, in Jamnia, the Jews went in and knocked down an imperial statue. They were angry because Jamnia is a very Jewish community. It's not Hellenized. It's still very Jewish. They did not want an imperial altar there, so they went and they knocked it down. That's a precipitating part of what causes Gaius Caligula, who was also, by the way, into self-deification. He loved to call himself a god and have people call him a god. Now he's got another reason to put a statue of himself in the middle of the Jerusalem temple. And so the early Christians and the Jews, not just the Christians, the Jewish Christians and the Jews and Jewish Christians both alike, know this is coming. And their reference point is going to be the book of Daniel, which is a Maccabean book. That's written about the revolution. And in that book, it talks about the abomination of desolation. And they see this coming. They're thinking, this is the end. This guy's going to put his statue in the temple. This is the end. It's a sign of the end. It's the end times. And for the Jewish world at that time, and what we're going to call Second Temple eschatology, for the Jews at that time, this was the end of the world. It was coming. It would, I mean, for example, I just read an article today in Bloomberg, and it talks about World War III and asks the question if we're not already in it. But you can imagine the use of nuclear weapons. That's an abomination of desolation. That's like a step too far. Well, for the Jews to have a foreign leader put an image of himself in the place where God dwells and no images are allowed, there's blasphemy off the charts. So it's going to exacerbate any tendencies anybody has for purity and holiness and zeal for the law, zeal for the land, zeal for the temple. Zeal was the watchword. And zeal was praised. Zeal was a value or a behavior that was lauded It was valorized. It was praised. To be zealous, it's like in the church, where in the church where you got people that are like uber holy or ultra holy, they get praised for what good Christians they are. Well, we had that back then, except this zeal would lead to death. That's what it does. This is absolutely the fact for the Apostle Paul, who, as we'll see in either this talk or the next one, where he, in his zeal for Torah and obedience to Torah, will get letters from the high priest that allow him to go to Damascus to persecute these Jewish Christians. And on that road, you know what happens. Jesus says to Paul, God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. I died for you. Will you accept that? Is that what Acts says? No. No, Acts asks the critical question that would be asked to anyone who was zealous for the truth and what they perceived as the truth and holiness. And that's, why are you persecuting me? What is it? What is it about me that forces you to think that you have to kill? What is it? What's the cause and effect here? What's that relationship? That was the moment Paul gets blinded, folks. The question is what blinds him. He can't see. Paul's not converted on the road to Damascus. He's not converted there. He's blinded on the road to Damascus by that question asked by the one who is named Jesus, who is now at the right hand of the Father, who says, why are you persecuting me? The first thing Paul has to go is, I'm not persecuting you, I'm persecuting Stephen. Oh, wait, if I'm persecuting Stephen, I'm persecuting you. What does this mean? He's blinded on the road to Damascus. He does not get converted until he's in the house of Ananias, his enemy. And he's blind. He's surrounded by these Christians that he's been sent to kill. They should be slicing and dicing him up and burying his body parts out in the desert there. But instead, Ananias uses the word brother and says, Brother Saul. And that is when the scales fell from Paul's eyes. And Paul realized there was something to this business of his desire for murder and his enemy's willingness to forgive him that opens his eyes. That's his first conversion. That's where he begins to have to go, I have to deconstruct. I have to let everything I thought about Jesus go, and I have to relearn anything that I'm going to learn ever about not only Jesus, but about God, Israel, Holy Scripture, and everything else. So that's Acts. When 39 rolls around, Pontius Pilate is going to make a big mistake. He's still in leadership there in Jerusalem, just like he was 7-8 years prior when he capitulated in the crucifixion of Jesus. But Pilate makes a mistake of going after a bunch of Samaritans and killing them, and he gets recalled to Rome. And that's the end of the Pontius Pilate story for Israel. And at that point, there's no Roman authority in the land. And one of the things you'll notice as you go through the book of Acts, whenever there's the Roman authority gets recalled, that leaves the Jewish authorities in charge. And whenever they're in charge, they go after the Christians. But then the Roman authority comes back and there's a period of peace for a while until they're recalled and then back again. Okay. It's one of the reasons the early Christians fled Jerusalem and its environs between 66 and 70, not just because the Romans were coming, but because the Roman authority was now no longer there. And so the Christians were fair game, not just for Nero in Rome, but also for the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem. So in 41, when there's no Roman authority, the high priest takes it upon himself to have James, the son of Zebedee, killed. Now remember, James, the son of Zebedee, is one of the three pillars: Peter, James, and John. Okay, there's another James, Jesus' brother. We're going to talk about him a lot. But right now, we're just talking about the son of Zebedee. So in 41, you have Gaius Caligula coming in. He's going to put his statue there in the temple. You've got the Jerusalem authorities coming down hard on the Christians, even killing one of the original 12 apostles. Now, remember, these are Christians. They got their 12 apostles, man. They're thinking, okay, we constitute the new Israel. They represent the 12 tribes. We're going to be this new thing in history. And then things are just going very, very, very poorly for them. And they start what I want to call a period of both freaking out and having to reckon with the long haul at the same time. And one of the things that will occur in the year 41 as a result of the death of James is that the Jerusalem church will begin gathering together the sayings of Jesus on different things, and they'll begin putting them together into what we would call a discourse. Now, Geert Tyson has a book called The Gospels in Context. The arguments that I'm taking, that I'm doing here, come straight out of this book, The Gospels in Context by Geert Tyson. In this book, Tyson contends that the material that you would find in Mark 13, that's called the little apocalypse, where the disciples say, "Oh Lord, look at the temple, look at the stones," and Jesus says, "I got news for you. These things are going to all come crashing down, and here's the signs of the end, and this is what's going to happen when," and da 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 da. Okay, all that. Tyson argues, this is all put together into that little apocalypse in the year 41. And why not? They thought it was going to be the end of the temple. So they're going to take different temple sayings of Jesus. They're going to add to it other sayings that are apocalyptic in nature. They may have well created certain sayings within that discourse and said, Jesus said. Maybe the living Christ by the Holy Spirit inspired them to write them in the name of Jesus. I don't know. But the point is that you have in Mark 13 this little apocalypse that is now formed to give the Christians an idea of how it all ends, how it's going to end. Okay, that little apocalypse. Okay, and you'll recognize immediately from Mark 13 the correlation to the book of Daniel, which is an apocalyptic piece of literature, how it all ends. Okay? Same thing in the book of Revelation, which is why the dispensationalists connect Mark 13, the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation, and the two Pauline letters that reflect that eschatology, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Now, you may wonder at this point, what does all this have to do with anything? It has everything to do with everything, because the worldview that's being constructed by Jewish Christianity at this point is centered on the temple and what's coming for the temple and the people of Israel. And it's perceived of as the end of the world kind of thing, but the Jerusalem church believed it had a promise, and that promise was Jesus would return sometime in relation to all these things happening. So they were fully expecting the end of human history already 5, 6, 7 years after the establishment of the church, so to speak, there in Jerusalem. Now, the second thing that Tyson argues gets developed at this time in 41 because of the martyrdom of James is the early church connected the martyrdom of James to the death of Jesus and they began creating what we now call the Passion narrative, which begins with the arrest of Jesus and ends with the burial of Jesus. And they structured that story. That's when they started to put together that story in the way that they wanted it told. So we have this martyrdom passion narrative and this apocalyptic discourse both being produced at this time. And interestingly enough, if we follow Campbell and Hugo Grotius and a few other scholars, and we date the Thessalonian letters to this very same time period, we see Paul echoing that theology. Now, I want to give you an idea of what that theology sounds like. I want to show you how the eschatology of the Thessalonian letters is reflecting not the gospel, but Second Temple Jewish eschatology. In other words, Jerusalem Christianity has combined apocalyptic and eschatology right here in the year 41. Okay, and so has Paul. So the key question in the Thessalonian letters asks, had the parousia already occurred? The Thessalonians are going, wait a second, we have all these events happening. Did he come? What happens to those who died already? And Jesus still hasn't returned. And this question, you can see it in 1 Thessalonians 1:10, 3:13, and 4:13 through 5:11. It's their big question. What do we do with those that have already died, knowing that Jesus is coming back? This same community in Thessalonica, which is primarily Gentile, is also being persecuted by the authorities. This runs through both letters, 1:6, 1 Thessalonians 1:6, 2:2, 2:14 to 16, 3:4, 3 verse 7, 2 Thessalonians 1:6. This is a community under persecution, just like the Jerusalem communities under persecution. Paul's making a connection between their persecution. In chapter 1, he says, you're being persecuted just like the Jerusalem church is being persecuted. And then he talks about the wrath of God in 1:16, which we read earlier, 4:6, and chapter 5, verse 9. So we have this wrath of God business in the midst of persecution with Christians that are wondering, when is Jesus going to return and take care of all this business? And then in the mix of this, Paul says, I got to tell you, there's a way this is going to happen. And you'll know these are the things you're looking for. 1, Jesus will descend. 2, there will be a command. 3, an archangel is going to call with the trumpet. 4, there's going to be a general resurrection. There's a sequence here. And so in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 7 and 8, you have mighty angels in flaming fire inflicting vengeance on these enemies. And in 1:9, they will suffer eternal punishment, eternal destruction, and exclusion. Now, that's Paul in the Thessalonian letters. That's Jerusalem Christianity. It's also Second Temple Judaism. I'll read you a few texts in a minute to demonstrate that. I want to add a side note here. There are those who want to go into the New Testament and they want to pretend they know Greek and they want to go, oh, Ionos doesn't mean eternal. Paul is not talking about eternal conscious torment. Where if Paul uses the phrase wrath of God, we're going to change it. And they try to use whatever it is in their heads to convince themselves that this is not in the Bible. It's in the damn Bible. It's there. It's clear as a bell that it's there. Okay? Don't pretend you know Greek and get in there and try and retranslate it to fit your little fairy theology. No. Let the Bible be what the Bible's going to be. Okay, enough of that rabbit trail. Now, let's continue by listening for a moment to some texts from Second Temple Judaism that will open up these themes for us. I need you to hear this. I need you to feel the milieu of the logic of these texts, because I've taken them from all kinds of different parts of Judaism. We've got some Pharisaic texts, Samaritan texts, Essene texts, Zealot texts, apocalyptic texts. So I want to read to you first from First Enoch. First Enoch, for those of you that want an introduction, is a compilation of 5 books into one book known as First Enoch, but they're distinct books. And this is going to come from book 2, and so it's First Enoch chapter 38. And by the way, again, let me go to for those of you that are not familiar with First Enoch, it comes from the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. Okay, and this is the edition by Charlesworth. It's the standard scholarly edition. So pseudepigrapha, remember, we've learned what that word means. It means writings under the name of another person, a famous person usually. So First Enoch, chapter 38 reads like this. When the congregation of the righteous shall appear, sinners shall be judged for their sins. They will be driven from the face of the earth. And when the righteous ones shall appear before the face of the righteous, those elect ones, their deeds are hung upon the Lord of the spirits. He shall reveal light to the righteous and the elect who dwell upon the earth. Where will be the dwelling of sinners? Where the resting place of those who denied the name of the Lord of spirits? It would be better for them not to have been born. When the secrets of the righteous ones are revealed, he will judge the sinners, and the wicked ones will be driven from the presence of the righteous and the elect. And from that time, those who possess the earth will neither be rulers nor princes. They shall not be able to even look upon the face of the holy ones, for the light of the Lord of spirits is shined upon the face of the holy, the righteous, the elect. And at that moment, kings and rulers shall perish. They'll be delivered into the hands of the righteous and holy ones. And from thenceforth, no one shall be able to call upon the Lord of the spirits to show them mercy, for their life is annihilated. Now, in the next book, First Enoch chapter 100, we have this. In those days, the father will be beaten together with his sons in one place, and brothers shall fall together with their friends in death, until a stream shall flow with their blood. For a man shall not be able to withhold his hands from his sons or his sons' sons in order to kill them. This is like Jesus talking in that little apocalypse, isn't it? Setting father against son, mother against daughter. This is all apocalyptic language. It's the breakdown of society where everyone is perceived as an enemy. Nor is it possible for the sinner to withhold his hands from his honored brother. From the dawn until the sun sets, they will slay each other. The horse shall walk through the blood of sinners up to his chest, and the chariot shall sink down up to its top. It's a lot of blood, folks. In those days, the angels shall descend into the secret places, and they will gather together in one place all those that gave aid to sin. And the Most High will arise on that day of judgment in order to execute a great judgment upon all the sinners. He will set a guard of holy angels over the righteous ones, and they'll keep them as the apple of his eye until all evil and all sin are brought to an end. From that time on, the righteous ones shall sleep a restful sleep, and there shall be no one to make them afraid. And then wise people will see, and the sons of earth will give heed to all the words of this book. Okay, that's First Enoch 100. A little bit earlier is an interesting text from First Enoch 71, and it reads like this. And if this sounds a little bit like the book of Revelation, it's because the author is alluding all over the place to First Enoch. There are all kinds of allusions to First Enoch in the book of Revelation. And just to remind you, the little letter of Jude, remember Jesus' brother Jude? He has a little letter in the New Testament there right before Revelation. And in that little letter, he quotes First Enoch, and he calls it Holy Scripture. He quotes First Enoch as though he's quoting the Bible. So again, This is literature that's esteemed very, very highly in certain circles. Okay, First Edict 71. With them is the antecedent of time. His head is white and pure like wool, his garment indescribable. I fell on my face, my whole body mollified, my spirit transformed. Then I cried with a great voice by the spirit of power, blessing, glorifying, extolling. And those are the blessings which went forth out of my mouth, being well pleased to be in the presence of that antecedent of time. Then the antecedent of time came with Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Phanuel, and 100,000 and 10 million times 100,000 angels that are countless. And then an angel came and greeted me and said, You, Son of Man, who are born in righteousness and upon whom righteousness has dwelt, the righteousness of the antecedent of time will not forsake you. And he added and said, He shall proclaim peace to you in the name of the world that is to come. For from here proceeds peace since the creation of the world. And so shall it be unto you forever and ever. And everyone that will come to exist and walk shall follow your path. Together with you shall be their dwelling places, and together with you shall be their portion. They shall not be separated from you forever and ever. So there shall be a length of days with that Son of Man, and peace to the righteous ones. His path is upright for the righteous in the name of the Lord. That is also part of the eschatology. Do the right thing, follow Torah, have zeal and devotion for God, and you will be rewarded. And part of that reward is you get to sit and watch others burn. That's your joy. Now, we see something similar or hear something similar from the apocalyptic book of Daniel, which reflects again Maccabean eschatology of the time. And so, Daniel chapter 7, you have, and I looked, and thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days, like the antecedent of time, the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. You see all the parallels here in the descriptors? The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming up from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000s times 10,000 stood before him. And this kingdom that is to come shall not be destroyed. Again, this Maccabean eschatology sets up a distinction between those who are Torah followers and those who aren't. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and by the way, I use, where is it? You can get, it's a great translation. I need to make sure that you can, if you can see this. Where am I? There we are. This is the translation I use, Abegg, Wise, and Cook. It's a very, very good translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these are things that, if you have any interest in Second Temple Judaism at all, you should have on your bookshelves, because there's no way to understand the New Testament without this literature. It's just simply not possible. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they have a scroll called the War Scroll, and I won't read it because it's just, I tried to find an excerpt from it, but the whole thing is so well knit together. But in the War Scroll, you have a description of the New Jerusalem. But for the Essenes, there were two messiahs, and then there was the prophet. So again, don't let anybody ever say, the Jews of Jesus' day believed. That's a false statement right off the bat, because the Jews of Jesus' day cannot be lumped into one category. That's like saying all Christians believe blank. That's not the case. So you had different views of Messiah, different understandings of what Messiah would do, what the messianic function was. They were basically all agreed that Messiah would fit some kind of Davidic warrior pattern. But there are two messiahs in Qumran. One is a priestly messiah, the other is a military messiah. And then there's also the prophet. There's a new temple, but within this war scroll, You have these angels and demons fighting each other. And then again, like we've seen, this eschatological retribution that's coming. And before this eschatological or apocalyptic retribution, where God separates the righteous from the unrighteous and dooms the unrighteous to flaming fire, there will be a time of woe. The same thing we find in Samaritan eschatology. Now, the Samaritans are Jews. They're just the Samaritans are the remnants of the northern Israelites, and they were outdoing the southern Israelites when the southern Israelites got carted off during the exile. Uh, that's when the temple at Gerizim got built, and it was beautiful and it was big, and everybody was doing their worship of Yahweh there. And when the Jews came back to Jerusalem, the wealthy Southerners, well, they wanted a temple. They thought God wanted their temple rebuilt because, and then eventually they take an army and destroy the Samaritan temple because, after all, they didn't like competition. But the Samaritans had a temple. They had a theology. They're Jewish through and through, and they had as a major part of one of the four major tenets of Samaritan theology is the day of the vengeance of the Lord. It's the day of recompense. So instead of where the Masoretic text in Deuteronomy 32, verse 35 reads, "Vengeance is mine and recompense." And you'll remember that quote, that text gets quoted by Paul in Romans 12 or 13. The Lord says, "Vengeance is mine," and all that. That text does not read, "Vengeance is mine and recompense" in the Samaritan Torah. In the Samaritan Torah, it says, "on the day of vengeance and recompense." In fact, that day is so important, Moses gets resurrected for that day. And as John MacDonald points out in his book, The Theology of the Samaritans, the sins of all people have been stored in advance, and they're known in every detail to the divine judge. And in addition to the regular apocalyptic literature in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we also have mention of angels and trumpets on this day. Now, Pharisaic apocalyptic eschatology can be found in literature known as the Psalms of Solomon. They're not written by Solomon, they're pseudepigraphic. They're written between, say, 70 and 45 BCE, around the time Rome comes in and takes over Israel and essentially becomes the foreign power that rules after the Maccabees had set them free in 167 and 63. The Romans come in and take over. And the Psalms of Solomon are written around this time. In the Psalms of Solomon, we have the important themes of a theocracy. Over and over, the Lord is king. There is the sacred law, which is the proof of God's care and divine providence. And according to Josephus, these emphases set off the Pharisees and Essenes from the Sadducees. But there's a strong doctrine of retribution in these Psalms. So if you have a copy of the Psalms of Solomon, you can go look at Psalm of Solomon 2, verse 34 and 35, the Psalm 13, verse 6, Psalm 15, verse 12, 13, and Psalm 17, verse 8. And those, so you can come back, watch this video, have your Psalms of Solomon open, and you can see in these texts this doctrine of eschatological retribution. So here, for example, is Psalm of Solomon 17, verses 21 to 25. "Look, Lord, raise up for them their king, the son of David, to rule over your servant Israel in the time known to you, O God. Undergird him with the strength to destroy the unrighteous rulers, to purge Jerusalem from Gentiles who trample her to destruction. in wisdom and in righteousness, to drive out the sinners from their inheritance, to smash their arrogance like a potter's jar, to shatter all their substance with an iron rod, to destroy the unlawful nations with the word of his mouth. And at his warning, the nations will flee from his presence, and he will condemn sinners by the thoughts of their hearts. Or this is Psalm of Solomon 15. And by the way, Psalms of Solomon is the first literature to use the term Messiah with reference to a figure, a messianic figure. The inheritance of sinners is destruction and darkness, and their lawless actions shall pursue them below into Hades. Their inheritance shall not be found for their children, for lawless actions shall devastate the homes of sinners. What we have here is a not so happy ending, because Jewish apocalyptic literature always contains a day of judgment or recompense, a day when lives are measured and rewards or punishments are distributed. And if you were part of the in group, you'd be rewarded as long as you remained faithful. But if you were not, you were a sinner, and Gentiles were automatically out. Messianic expectations during this time period that we're talking about coalesced around this theme. And all messianic figures come back with righteous judgment, often with angel armies and trumpets. And the time before the day will be a time of great tribulation and trouble for the saints. And that's Second Temple eschatology. It's also the eschatology we find in First and Second Thessalonians. So when you read here, it is right for God to repay those who afflict you, and to those who are being afflicted to rest with us when Jesus is revealed, and with flaming fire he will mete out punishment. They will undergo the penalty of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord. Do you see how this language is identical to the apocalyptic language that we've just read in any number of sectarian groups in Judaism? It's identical. It's a frame of reference. It's a worldview. It's a way to perceive how it all ends. And everybody, to one degree or another, with the exception of the Sadducees, bought into this. That's their worldview. That's how they see it. Okay? Now, what happens when Jesus doesn't return in 41? Well, first, I've got to get back to my notes, otherwise I'm going to end up rabbit trailing. First, we want to note that prior to the completion of the statue, Caius Caligula dies. And so the statue, of course, will never get set up in the temple in Jerusalem. But the year 41 was an apocalyptic year for the early church. And that's that again, Jerusalem Christianity is going to begin framing the gospel story about Jesus. Paul's going to write his Thessalonian letters, and so it should come as no surprise to us that there is a very clear similarity in language between something like Mark 13 and the letters to the Thessalonians. We do know that Paul spent 2 weeks with James and Peter. What did they talk about? Well, they would have talked about Jesus, of course, but they would have also talked about some of this apocalyptic stuff that's going on. And so Paul takes in the Jerusalem church's view of things. That's going to be his view. Okay? And it's not going to change until after 41, when Jesus doesn't return. And we have now these silent years. But before we get there, we have to set up another part of our argument. Man, I am really I'm really behind. Okay. We want to talk at the end of this here episode about Paul and Jerusalem Christianity. Okay. Most of us in the church believed everybody was happy clappy all the time, and they had a few issues, but basically they got along. And then by the time we get into the second century, and you have the early second century church fathers trying to establish their authority, and so they're going, well, I knew Billy Bob, who knew Frank, who knew Peter, and Nathan here, he knew Jenny, who knew so and so, who knew Paul, and we create what's called apostolic succession. Okay, and the early church fathers were really big on this, but they were also really big on something else. Because Marcion's influence, Marcion came out and said, and this is around, say, the early teens of the second century. Marcion came out and said that the only true apostle was the Apostle Paul, that the Jerusalem apostles, they were false apostles. They didn't get anything because they retained their Judaism. Paul transcended his Judaism, and so it's his good God to believe in, not the bad God of Jewish Christianity. Now, Marcion raised some very important questions. He answered them wrong, but so did the early church fathers. They answered those questions wrong too. Now, in the second century, while we have these early church fathers trying to say, hey, our teaching goes back to the apostles, at the same time, they're trying to do what Luke did in the book of Acts. They're trying to say all the apostles agreed on these certain doctrines. And so when you get to the Apostles' Creed, what's called the Apostles' Creed, the myth, or the legend, I should say, that surrounds that is each apostle contributed a line to the Apostles' Creed. And when we're all done, we have the apostolic doctrine, and everybody gets along, and we all got to believe this. Okay, that's all smoke and mirrors, friends. From the post 41 era, the Apostle Paul and the Jerusalem church would be at odds. And we're going to see this in the letter to the Galatians. And so we go to Paul's letters, and we notice that there are these opponents. Well, who are these opponents? In Galatians, the verb Judaizer is used. In 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the opponents are called false apostles. So evidently, they're either apostles, and Paul says they're false, or they're claiming to be apostles, and thus they're false. But in Philippians, they're neither Judaizers nor false apostles. By the time Paul writes Philippians, they're just dogs. And they're hyper zealous dogs. I mean, by the time Paul gets to writing Philippians in 52, he is irate at what's going on. Well, what was happening? Well, we know what was happening, because in Galatians, Paul makes it very clear that it started at Antioch. Whatever's happening in Paul's churches, in his mission field, as he's writing his letters to the Corinthians, to the Galatians, to the Romans, and on, whatever's happening there is due to whoever these opponents are. And who are these opponents? Where are they from? Who sent them? Well, the first clue we have is going to be in Galatians chapter 2, where when Paul is at Antioch and Peter is with him at Antioch, and the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians are all eating the same Eucharist. That is, they're passing around the same loaf of bread, and they're passing around the same cup of wine. And the Eucharist, my friends, is the earliest Christian ritual. It was practiced almost immediately from the get-go when Christians would get together. We would say, oh, they had a love feast, and that included bread and wine. But there was a specific part early on in the liturgical tradition of the apostolic era where the Eucharist does get singled out. and it becomes the ritual that is for the church. And at this point, you've got Gentiles and Jews, and they're both eating together. Well, what does that mean? That means that these Jews that are eating with these Gentiles are choosing to ignore kosher food laws. That is, at home, Peter and other Jews would keep a kosher table. But when it came to the church, they would be willing to share the Eucharistic table, the bread and the cup, with the Gentiles. That bothered the real zealous Jewish Christians that Paul calls false brethren who were sent to spy on us. They would report back. They would just make that little journey from Antioch down to Jerusalem and say, hey, James, Paul's up there and Peter's up there and they're all eating with Gentiles. Well, James doesn't send emissaries to talk to Paul. He sends emissaries to tell Peter, cut it out. This is James, Jesus' brother. For those of you who say, oh, I wish I could have lived in Jesus' day and I would have followed him and understood him, the answer is no, you wouldn't. His own brothers didn't get it. His own disciples didn't get it. The Galilean group that we call the apostles that end up in Jerusalem, they never really got Jesus. They didn't. And you can see it immediately, even after the resurrection, when, at least according to Luke, the only thing they're interested in is, oh, is it now the apocalyptic eschatological time for the kingdom? You're going to bring the kingdom of Jesus? We're here waiting for it. That's all they could think about. That their head was stuck there. And it remained stuck there. And the consequences of remaining stuck there was it was also stuck in the frame of zeal for the Torah. Torah says you cannot have an unkosher table. You can't. Not if you're a Jew. If you're a Jew, there are 3 markers of identity. You are circumcised if you're a male. You eat a kosher table and you keep the Sabbath. You honor the Sabbath. You rest on it. Those are the 3 identity markers. Now here in Antioch, it's all about food and that Eucharist, okay? Now, these folks that come from James to speak to Peter, to tell Peter to cut it out, are essentially saying that there are 2 distinct churches. There is a Jewish church and there's a Gentile church, and the twain shall never meet. They don't connect. They don't connect. And Paul is absolutely adamant they do connect. And so there's a battle that goes on in Antioch. And this battle is so heated, and James' authority is so strong. Of course, Peter obeys. But then so does everybody else. And eventually that's going to include Barnabas, Paul's right-hand guy. In fact, Paul was Barnabas's right-hand guy in the beginning, and it would in Paul said it would flip, but Barnabas would go with the Jerusalem church and James, Jesus' brother, and Peter, and they backed away from the common table. And Paul is left standing by himself at Antioch, friends. He's the odd one out. In other words, Paul lost at Antioch. That was his home church. He lost his own home church. One of the 2 major centers of early Christianity, Jerusalem and Antioch. And Paul is now on the outs with both of them. And so he goes out into the mission field on his own, and he'll do a second and his third mission. One of the things that Jerusalem Christianity was trying to do was extend its authority. So here you have Jerusalem, and now it's going to go up into Syria, which is Gentile territory. And it's going to say to the Jewish Christians, we have authority over you geographically here. One of Paul's arguments was that's not the case. He was the one that was given authority in Gentile territory. But the Jerusalem church wasn't going to buy that. And so they sent out missionaries to Paul's churches to bring them back to the gospel, what they perceived was the gospel, which meant that Gentiles had to become fully Jewish in order to be fully Christian. And Paul's saying no. In Galatians, he says no. The kind of vitriol and anger we find in Paul in Galatians is extraordinary. You'll notice Galatians has no thanksgiving at the beginning of it, like all the other letters. I thank my God. I hit my knees in prayer. Blah, blah, blah. Not for the Galatians. It's just, I'm Paul. I'm an apostle. God revealed his son to me. You better believe it. I'm going to tell you a story. And then he calls them stupid idiots. You know, in chapter 3, verse 1, the Greek term is idiotes. And so when I translate it, I just say, instead of some of your translations, oh, foolish Galatians. No, it's you stupid shits. I mean, that's the language Paul is using to these Galatians. You know, he's insulting them. And he insults these false teachers that have permeated Galatia in chapter 6 when he says, oh, they want to cut the tip of their penis off, they should just cut the whole damn thing off. I mean, that's what the Greek text says. They should emasculate themselves. Paul pulls no punches in Galatians when it comes to his opponents. And the same thing is true in Corinth. When you get in First Corinthians, Paul's first letter there, well, it's actually his second. First Corinthians is his second letter. There's the letter of tears. He writes this First Corinthians, and he's trying to deal with the fact that Peter himself has been to Corinth. And there's a certain party there that's going, oh, you know, when Paul first came to Corinth, he preached the same gospel Peter's preaching to us now. But since he's come back, he's preaching a different message. So Paul's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. This is where Paul's having to deal with the question of duplicity when it comes to his apostleship and the letters, because the Corinthians are going, yeah, the first time you came to us as a dispensationalist. Second time you came to us, you came as a universalist. We're going to stick with Peter. He's a dispensationalist. He gets it. That's what's going on in Corinth, this factionation between Paul and Peter, and it produces other parties as well, which all end up in conflict. And so Paul's trying to keep that church together. He's watching it fail before his very eyes. In 1 Corinthians, he's trying to keep it together, and he evidently writes another letter where he rips them a new you know what. And then in our 2 Corinthians, when you have Paul talking about, I've done my best to be a comfort to you, and here's some other information, you get to chapter 10 through 12. There, not only are the interlocutors that have come to Corinth called super apostles, are called servants of Satan, who dress themselves up in light, which was another apocalyptic part of the view of Satan as this light bearer. That's what Lucifer means, light bearer. And by the way, the only figure in the Bible that's called Lucifer or light bearer is Jesus in the book of Revelation. That's another story. So you have Paul all alone at Antioch, remaining faithful to his calling, that the gospel that goes to the Gentiles is meant to be Torah free. That is, the gospel and the way to participating in this new reality has nothing to do with obedience to Torah. It has everything to do with something else. And we'll talk about that something else in the last lecture. 11:45, 12:45. I've been at this for another hour. Holy cow. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and we'll pick up right from here in the next talk. But let's have a little conversation for now. Or we can just take a break. It's up to you.
I have a question, Michael. Uh, I'm a total amateur with this stuff.
That's
So
me too.
I'm just absorbing the information you're giving us. I did read, uh, and I don't know why, but last year or so, NT Wright's Paul, a biography,
Mhm.
uh, and it's not. Can you riff a little bit on whether you follow his chronology? My memory is, if it's correct, and I could be wrong, that Wright sees um, Paul having these conflicts that you're referring to. I think he's more uptight about circumcision than anything else, whether Gentiles have to be circumcised, and it's a fairly benign narrative, as I recall, that Wright provides that, that Paul basically is successful in persuading James to get it eventually.
Yeah.
Is that something you're going to get to eventually, or do you
So,
disagree with
so,
that
so
narrative?
I will, I think I'll talk about, but let me say this about Tom. Tom is a brilliant scholar. Okay. I mean, he really, really, really is. But his work is already passé.
Okay.
So one of the interesting things that happened was Tom's in the middle of writing his 5 volume series, starts with the New Testament, its environment or something, and then there's Jesus and the victory of God. Then
Mhm,
there's the resurrection of the Son of God. So he's writing his book on Paul, and he's finished it up, and it's at the publisher and stuff, right? When Campbell's book, Deliverance of God, gets published,
mhm, mhm,
that book demolished, in a sense, beforehand, all the arguments that Wright would muster up in his 2 volume Paul and the Faithfulness of God.
mhm,
Tom, Tom is a bishop. He has to say good things about the church. He has to make sure that there's harmony in the church. And so he does really, really downplay these conflicts in early Christianity.
mhm.
Whereas as a Girardian, man, I see mimesis and conflicts everywhere there. Now, maybe I'm overstating the case. Maybe they really were happy clappy, but I don't see that. I mean, for example, the book of Acts, chapter 2 and chapter 4 says, oh, they all got together, they ate and worshiped together and sang songs, and they, just did their little house churchy thing, and everybody was happy, happy, happy. That's not the case. Only the Aramaic speaking ones were happy because the Greek speaking Jewish Christians, they were being left out. They were already marginalized. There was already an outgroup. And so in Acts 6, you have the conflict between the Hebrews and the Hellenists, right there in Jerusalem. My sense is that any attempt to cover over these conflicts in early Christianity, one stems from fear of the Bible having conflicts with itself, and
Mhm.
two, Christians having conflict with themselves, and the church leaders. I typically don't tend to trust bishops or priests that do theology. Um, I mean, I don't trust the university professors either. I don't trust many of them, but there is a problem there for me. I again, I respect Tom. I've gained a lot from Tom over the years, but his work is already passe.
So the Campbell book that would rival Paul, a biography, which I think is must be Wright's popularization of his big two
Right.
volume scholar thing, would be The Deliverance of Paul. Is that the
The
title of it?
deliverance of God.
Deliverance of God.
Well,
Okay.
is that? I'm just trying to think if that. Yeah, that's probably or his Pauline dogmatics. Probably his
Okay.
Pauline dogmatics would be the rival book to
Okay.
that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks.
sure.
Michael, here in our town in Krugersdorp in South Africa, there's a movement. Some of the people that went to the charismatic church to which I belonged many years ago have moved on to this movement. It's kind of a messianic Christianity uh, conflation. I'm not sure exactly what they teach and believe, but strangely, one of the guys that was a worship leader with me in the days when I was still a worship leader, if that's something at all, um, he moved on and became sort of a theist. He just believes in a God and, very much winding up the clock idea and God just not being involved in humanity at all since. And his wife is now in this Messianic Christianity movement. So, you know, when I go there, I think he sort of doesn't want me to come and visit him anymore, because the moment that we discuss any of these things, it becomes such a heated conversation between herself with her Messianic views and so on. What is your take on that?
I think it's stupid. Any messianic anything is stupid. But one, it fails to reckon with the fact Jesus rejected the title Messiah. He wouldn't have anything to do with it. For him, it was a bad term. That's number one. Number two, again, they're going to understand messiahship in that Second Temple Jewish Davidic messianic framework. They're doing it outside the context of how Paul and the writer of the fourth gospel are going to understand this category of Messiah, which is crucified Messiah. You know, it's a complete and utter, it's beyond a paradox. It's beyond an oxymoron. These two words don't even belong together. You know, it's like south and south on magnets. You can't get them to stick, and yet the cross melds them, you know. I just think it's dumb. Here's the thing, Deval, let me share this with you. You will never convince anybody to change their minds theologically with arguments and logic and evidence. People are emotionally invested in their belief systems. We just saw this in America politically. People are so invested in their belief systems that they will hate other people. Okay? And they'll do so thinking they're righteous. Okay? It's the same thing with Christians. You can't change their minds by arguing with them theologically. The only way people change their minds in anything is when their life goes to shit and they pray and their God doesn't hear their prayers. And then they go, oh, I'm going to quit believing in God. I'm going to quit praying. They don't stop and go, maybe the God I'm praying to doesn't exist. Maybe I have yet to meet the true and living God, you know. But that it takes that existential crisis. That's when you can go in and say, of course your God doesn't work. Of course you can't pray. Your God doesn't exist. Let me introduce you to the Father of the crucified, the God that suffers. Now we can have a conversation, you know. So if you all can hang on to some questions until the next time, my back is killing me and I need to stand up. So I can either stand up and talk to you if we have questions, but that's what's going to happen. If we still have questions, I'm going to stand up because I'm tired of sitting. Or we can take, say, a half-hour break for lunch and come back in a half hour. What's your pleasure? Any pleasure? Yeah, right. A standing desk. Not in this little room. That'd be too big. And I like this little desk. It looks right out the window. It's nice, but my sciatica is troublesome today and my butt hurts. So how about if we gather together exactly at the half-hour mark, which is 27 minutes from now? Will that work for everybody?
Yep, it works.
Okay.
Sounds good.
I'll see you all at 1:30. If you don't want me to be hearing what's going on at your house, you'll want to mute your microphone. And if you don't want me to see what's going on at your house, you want to mute your camera. All right. I'll look forward to seeing everybody in a half hour.
Okay.